All right, next up on the agenda tonight is a presentation by Ted, WR4T. Ted is in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he's going to talk to us about what is meant by and what is uh, the good news about FlexRadio. You're on, Ted.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Sound check?
Yep.
Good. Okay. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. So if someone can give me permission, I probably don't have permission.
I think you have permission now.
Okay. Well,
Everybody does now, I think, Brent.
I will give it a try. Okay. Can you guys see a Flex 6400 picture on the screen now?
That's it. Yep.
Okay. Yep. Good. Sounds like it's working. Well, I gave a presentation in March, and I've been practicing. Jerry and I have been in a CW class, a QRQ or high-speed CW class that started in January, and kind of in mid to late January, I got a new radio, and I was showing Jerry some of the capabilities, and he thought this would, he was not familiar with software-defined radios, or in particular the Flex radio, and thought this might be something that would be interested. Other club members might be interested. And I'm going to hope not to be too much of an advertisement for Flex or a sales pitch for Flex. There's plenty of great software-defined radios out there in the market. Flex was certainly the first, and always kind of considered a leader and an innovator in this space. But there are many wonderful software-defined radios on the market now, and more are coming all the time. I really think that software-defined radios are probably going to replace the super heterodyne architecture, and people are familiar with super heterodyne radios, and they've been the mainstay of radio technology since Armstrong invented the super heterodyne, I think, in the 1920s. So the super heterodyne architecture has had a very long run, but I do expect that software-defined, except there'll be a few exceptions. Anything that requires extremely low power has to operate on a battery for a very long time. Software-defined radios can't compete. They require more power when in standby or receive mode than a super heterodyne radio architecture does. So I do want to talk a little bit more generally about software-defined radio. And let me just ask people, although I can't, let's see if I can get everyone up here on my screen. Yeah, I think I can get everyone up on my screen. I'm just curious as to if anyone on here has a Flex or an Anand, or if they know if they have a software-defined radio. You don't see any hands. I think someone. Okay, Brett.
Yeah, I have a bunch of receivers, Ted. I have the little AirSpy, and I got some SDR plays, and I have an SDR IQ and a bunch of other things, but I don't have anything that transmits.
Okay, very good. Well, they have a lot of same capabilities on the receive side. Maybe people have a software-defined radio and they're not aware of it. Anyone have an ICOM 7300? Seems like everyone has one of those. But
yeah, okay. I got one of those.
Okay, that's a software-defined radio too. It's a ICOM took a little bit different approach, but they used the software-defined radio technology to pack a whole bunch of capability in a very low-cost package. And I've used the 7300. It's a fantastic radio. It doesn't have the cleanest transmitter in the world, but that would be about the only thing I'd say. But for the price, I don't think there's anything out there that comes close to it in that price point. What a great radio to have when you're coming into ham radio for your first radio. So first off, let me try to at least explain in layman's terms what might the difference be between a software-defined radio versus a traditional super heterodyne radio. And there are super heterodyne radios with analog to digital converters and digital signal processing in them. That technology started to pop up in the late 80s. And by the late 90s, it was mainstream. And even all the super heterodyne radios you buy today have digital signal processing in them. And there's a lot of similarity between them, so it can be kind of confusing. But the main difference between a software-defined radio and a super heterodyne type radio is that the software-defined radio generally does an analog to digital conversion very close to the antenna terminal of the radio. And the latest generation of software-defined radios, it's directly at the antenna terminal. The software-defined radios of about 10 years ago essentially had a direct conversion receiver, or something called a homodyne receiver. If anyone's familiar with a homodyne, and then an analog to digital conversion. But all the modern software-defined radios have an analog to digital converter right at the antenna. And then after that analog to digital converter, everything is done with software. It's all done by microprocessors, field programmable gate arrays, microprocessors, and digital signal processing hardware. And there's no traditional analog circuitry in a software-defined radio. So there's no mixers, there are no crystal filters. There may not even be a phase lock loop or local oscillator. There is a clock. There's a very important clock that drives the analog to digital converter, but you don't have to have a phase lock loop of a traditional sense, or what you'd call a VFO. So you don't have VFOs of a traditional sense. Everything's done with software algorithms, with digital signal processing algorithms. The other thing I'll just mention is, and if I'm getting too technical, just wave your hands and I'll skip this. But the conventional digital signal processing radios, like the FT1000 was one of the early ones. They're just regular super heterodyne radios. They still have crystal filters in one of the early IF stages. It's just that very last IF stage. If you have a triple conversion, that third IF stage, or if it's a double conversion type radio, that second IF stage would be an analog to digital converter with the final filtering and demodulation done in software. And that's radios that did that started appearing in the early 90s. They're very expensive at first, and then they kind of became mainstream in the late 90s and into the 2000s. The first software-defined radio out there was the Flex ST. I think they called it the Flex 1000, if I remember, and I think it came out around 2005, right around that time frame. So I'll talk a little bit about the Flex, because that's the radio I have, and some of the capabilities you get. These radios generally now come in two flavors. They come in the flavor of a radio with absolutely no controls on it. It's just a black box. And then, and that's how they first appeared. They had no knobs, no buttons, nothing. It was just a black box with connectors on it. And then to go a little bit more mainstream, the manufacturers started to add a more traditional front panel with buttons, knobs, LEDs, CRT displays. So the Flex has two versions with it, and actually prior to this latest 6000 series, I think they came out with this around 2013, 2014. Everything before that did not have a front panel. It was just a black box. So the 6400 is their entry-level radio with the black box. And then the 6400M is the one with the full front panel on it. And then they also have a 6600 and a 6700. And the big difference between the 66 and 6700 is that they have dual analog to digital converters in both of those radios. And the dual converters essentially allow you to do some advanced signal processing, such as diversity receive, and full duplex operation. The radio is those higher end radios are actually capable of receiving and transmitting simultaneously. You can only transmit on one frequency, but you can receive on multiple other frequencies while you're transmitting. And so that can be useful for contesters. You do have to have a lot of isolation between your transmit and your receive antenna, but it's something that is very common now in contest stations to be running full duplex. It's also very useful for satellite operation. Anyone who's done satellite operation has known that full duplex is, because of Doppler shift, full duplex is pretty common also for moon bounce. Full duplex is pretty common because you want to monitor your own reflected signal off the moon and track it as through the Doppler shift. So just the standard 6400 is this black box on the left. Again, it's no front panel at all. That has some advantages and it has some disadvantages. One of the big advantages is it makes a much lower cost radio. There is a lot of cost in this front panel, particularly with all the encoders and push buttons and all that go to make up a front panel. If you look up at like one of those advanced radios like the FTDX 101 or the FTDX 5000 and look at the front panel on a radio like that, really radios like that can probably only be made in Japan because Japan's the only one who has that kind of technology to make those very complicated front panels with all those buttons and knobs cost effectively. I mean, obviously you can, if money's no object, but that's a very expensive part of any radio. So there's a big cost advantage by going with the black box approach. You also have some disadvantages. Obviously, if you need to buy a computer, you need to have a dedicated computer for running that. If you're a digital guy and you run FT8 and do some of the other digital modes, you're already going to have a computer in your shack, so it's not going to be an extra cost. For others, it very well could be an extra cost to have a separate computer. It really depends on your situation. So, and then learning how to control a radio without knobs to spin, a VFO knob to spin, setting your filters and all that. For some people can be quite an adjustment and they don't like it. For others, it comes very naturally. So for me, first, I didn't think I was going to like it because I was always the type of person who wanted knobs and buttons. But as these newer radios got to the point where they had so many menus and hidden features, and they had very cryptic displays and options, I also found that actually controlling it and setting up a radio with a computer in many ways was a big advantage. Some things are much easier to do. Others like spinning the VFO knob can be harder, or setting the volume level. My personal after using a software-defined radio for a while, I built some homebrew ones. If anyone's heard of a soft rock, I made a soft rock, which was actually a transceiver, and ran that with Power SDR software. And I actually found tuning and adjusting the filters to be pretty natural and pretty easy for me. I do miss the volume knob, to be quite frankly. I don't miss the VFO knob that much. But I really do miss having a volume knob. I do find that kind of having to move a slider up and down is not, for me, very convenient. So, kind of my personal reaction. I'll take a moment to see if anyone has any questions. And before that, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the radio, how you operate it, some of its capabilities. And I'll probably talk a little bit about the digital modes. And that's when you operate digital modes, that's one of the areas where the software-defined radios are really nice, particularly the Flex. The Flex has some unique features there, and also for some contesting capability and the ability to interface with other software in your shack. There's a lot of capabilities you have in the Flex that's coming out in some of the other software-defined radios. So, anyone have any questions? I don't see anything. So before I dive into talking about the Flex in more detail, talk about a few other software-defined radios out there, just so people get an idea what's available. This is a radio that's from Expert. They call it the MB1. It's kind of based on the Sun SDR, but it's a much higher end box. This particular radio has a Windows 10 computer built into it, so it makes it a pretty expensive radio. I think it's around $7,000 in the US dollars from a US distributor, and for some reason things seem to be a little bit less expensive in the US. I think in the EU it with exchange rate and all that, it comes out to be closer to $9,000 US in the EU, and it's actually made in Russia, or assembled in Russia, where everything's made globally now, but it is assembled in Russia. And this is a very there's a few videos on it. It's a very interesting radio, got a lot of capability, and it has a full front panel, but it also is completely controllable from a laptop, a Linux. You can run it on Linux, Windows, Apple iOS. It supports all the different operating systems. So that's the Expert. Another one is Apache Labs, makes a lot of different software-defined radios. They didn't design these. The interesting about, are people familiar with Tapper? The Tapper organization, Tucson? Yeah. Tapper had a project called the HPSDR project, the High Performance SDR project, and they had a bunch of software-defined radio enthusiasts all come together, and they designed an open source software-defined radio, and you could buy it in a bunch of cards. And that towards the end of it, they actually implemented it on something called a Hermes board, which included the FPGA and all the software. And this company in India just cloned it. It's a Tapper clone, essentially. And then they started extending it and enhancing it. But the Anand is also a popular software-defined radio. It's a little bit more expensive than the Flex 6400. So their 30-watt radio, you can see here, starts at $1,900, which is what a Flex 6400 runs, $1,900. And then their lowest cost 100-watt HF plus 6 meters is around $2,800, and then they go up from there. So again, another very popular software-defined radio out there. I hear a lot of Anands on the air. And then the last one of the newer entrants, the Elecraft K4, which if anyone's familiar with the Elecraft KX or the K3 and the K3S, those are super heterodyne radios. This is a software-defined radio. This is Elecraft's first software-defined radio. They went with the full front panel control. They do not have one that is just a black box at this point in time. They don't make just a black box. They also make just the front panel only. It's like a remote front control head, and you can buy a duplicate and you can operate it remotely with a remote front control head. And they also have software that allow a virtual front panel that allows you to control it entirely from a computer. So that's one of the newer ones. Then I think the last thing I'll mention is that in addition to the ICOM 7300, you have the ICOM 7610, also a software-defined radio. Yaesu just recently released their first two software-defined radios, the FTDX10 and the FTDX101. Those are both software-defined radios. The one thing I do note from the radios coming from Japan, they have not yet come up with the complete ability to control the radio virtually from a computer with all and get a complete virtual display. But the radios are software-defined radios and do have a lot of remote control capability. And then Kenwood, I'm not as familiar with the Kenwood models, but I know their newest radios are also software-defined radios. So you kind of see the writing in the wall that right now, except for maybe some of the lowest end radios, everything's going software-defined radio, and the Superhets are fading away. It probably won't be too long before it will be very difficult to find anyone who makes crystal filters. They're already getting the number of manufacturers who make crystal filters is a fraction of what it used to be. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the FlexRadio itself. And I am I'm going to talk about a few capabilities of the basic Flex 6400. It's the simplest radio they have. It has one analog to digital converter in it. They call it a spectrum capture unit. That spectrum capture unit essentially receives the entire RF spectrum in between, I think it's 10 kilohertz is the low end. It might be 30 kilohertz is the lowest frequency it receives. Everything up to 55 megahertz continuously. And you can have two PAN adapters displayed simultaneously. Right now I have two PAN adapters. They're in the 40 meter band. And the PAN adapters can be up to 7 megahertz wide. So you can not quite see two bands at the same time. You can see, you can get all of 80 meters and all of 40 meters in one PAN adapter display, but that's about it. But they can be 7 megahertz wide. And you can have the PAN adapters on two different bands. So I can have one PAN adapter on 40 meters and another PAN adapter on 10 meters. Now, since this radio only has one analog to digital converter, or what they call a spectral capture unit, all the PAN adapters share one antenna. So if I have one PAN adapter on 10 meters and another PAN adapter on 80 meters, I better have an 80 meter through 10 meter antenna, or I'm not going to be getting a very good signal on one, whatever band the antenna is cut for. The more advanced models have two analog to digital converters, and you can do the same thing, but then you can have two different antennas. You can have a 10 meter antenna on the one PAN adapter, and you could have an 80 meter antenna on your second PAN adapter. The other thing you have are what they call these receivers, slice receivers. Some people think of them as VFOs. They're very similar to VFOs. You can also think about them as two main receivers. I'm not going to say a main receiver and a sub receiver, because both receivers have full capability and the same performance specifications. So whether you're on receiver A or receiver B, they have identical capabilities. Again, some people refer to them as slice receivers. So I'm going to turn on the audio here and just let me see if you guys can hear. See if I can tune in the station. Can you guys hear that okay?
No.
You cannot. Is it too soft, too low?
Don't hear anything.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop sharing my screen, and I'm gonna have to start again. So let me stop and restart it, because I did not include sharing the audio.
I'm assuming you still got all of that. I'm not sure, but
okay, you hearing audio now?
Yep.
This radio I ever had, I was about 12 years old, I guess.
Okay. So right now I've got one receiver set for the 40 meter digital band.
I conjured my mother.
There's some, I believe, PSK 31 going on here.
Ted,
yeah.
You're talking and the voice is talking, so there's a mix there.
Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll turn it down. I'll turn it down for a moment.
Okay.
Radio Moscow, BBC, all of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And fate would have it.
So, pardon me. Okay, so I've got receiver A up here in the digital portion of the 40 meter band, where the PSK 31 window generally is, and then the B receivers up here in the 40 meter sideband portion of the band. You can actually, I've got one muted, and the other receiver is unmuted, but the volume's turned down. The other thing you can do is you can put all of, you know, I can set receiver B here, so all the audio comes out of the left speaker. And I can set receiver A similarly, so all the audio would be out of the right speaker. And that way, if I was listening to two different frequencies, maybe in a contest, it's, you know, outside of a contest, I'm not sure how often you'd want to hear two things at once. But having two, when you're in a contest, if you're trying to work two stations very quickly, you know, hearing one in each ear is very convenient. Very convenient way of trying to set that up. Also, on the 6600, if you're running diversity and you want to have diversity, you'd actually set both receivers for the exact same frequency, but you'd put them on two different antennas. Here, on this particular radio, if I change antennas, you'll note that both receivers automatically flip because I only have one analog to digital converter, and both receivers have to share the antenna. I can't have two receivers using two different antennas. With the 6600 and most of the other radios, you can have each receiver with its own antenna, and then you can set your A receiver and B receiver to the exact same signal. You can put your A receiver in the left ear, your B receiver in the right ear, and you can actually do full diversity that way. You can also change the phasing between the A and the B receiver to try to null out interference. So those are some advanced things you can do with software-defined radios that are not easily implemented with analog. I'm not going to say you can't do it with analog radios, that you can, but it's very, very complex and not easily implemented where it becomes child's play, so to speak, or simply a matter of programming with a software-defined radio. So, you know, tuning the radio, there's lots of ways of tuning. I'm going to turn the volume back up and just show you how you can tune up and down the band again.
Laurel. Okay. It's about 90 miles due north
Maybe
of
I'm too loud.
In the south.
You can click in tune, so you can see there's a QSO going on here, a QSO going on here and here. You can click on it and get pretty close.
Like a real radio.
Okay.
Unless I get the fellow's name.
So you can click the tune. Which is it's hard to get exactly on frequency clicking and tuning, but you can get pretty close pretty quickly, and you can, you know, QSY up and down the van pretty quickly. You can also drag. I stopped talking here. So you can drag, and then you can also use the scroll wheel on the mouse, which really gives you some more fine tuning. So you can just rock the frequency back and forth with your mouse, which is about as close as you can get to a VFO knob. Like I said, with the mouse control, the ability to slide tune, the ability to click tune. You can change your frequency steps over here. I'm using 50 hertz frequency steps. I can change that to, if I change it to 500 coarser steps, it does make it easier to click tune. And one thing you do notice with modern radios and pretty accurate frequency oscillators, people are pretty much always on an even kilohertz channel for the most part. And as far as filters, you've got a full selection of bandwidths. These are all the filters that are available for sideband, anywhere from 1.8 to 6 kilohertz. And if that's not enough for you, you can change the filter. You can just click and drag and change the high cut on the filter. Oops. Might be able to hear it getting wider. stops talking.
Foxtrot, go for Sierra 2, Foxtrot, Germany 4.
Change the low cut. You can change your passband tuning by sliding the whole window up and down. You can throw in notch filters and drag notch filters up and down the band. So all the basic controls are there. As far as transmitting, got the ability to select multiple audio inputs on the microphone, control your compressor. I'm going to mute this. I'll go ahead and mute that. So you have your audio level, compression metering is all available. There's an equalizer. Let me turn some of these other displays off here. So there's an equalizer on the transmit side. I think it's an 8-band equalizer if I remember. There's an equalizer on the receive side. Right now my receive equalizer is set to be flat. You can turn off the equalizers individually. Just you can turn on and off the transmit receive equalizer. You have memory channels. Bring those up. It kind of uses a spreadsheet kind of interface for your memories. Probably not my favorite way to do memories, but this is how they've implemented it in this particular version of the Flex software. There are pretty regular updates that come with the Flex software, so they may come up with different ways of doing memories. But at the moment, this is they have this spreadsheet type memory. So I've got W1AW on 20 meters. Some different nets, some 6-meter frequencies, some of my favorite CW frequencies in each of the bands, some of my favorite sideband frequencies, the 60-meter channels I've got programmed in here. I think there might be a 5th one too that I haven't programmed in yet, but these are the 60-meter channels. So all that can be done with memories. I think the next thing I want to talk about is just operating on digital modes, which is one of the reasons one of the advantages that the software-defined radios offer is that operating the digital modes can be a little bit simpler. And the real advantage is that when I'm running with my digital software, FLDigi is what I'm using here, I don't have to run any cables. I don't need a sound card. None of that is required. So let me make sure I've got everything still set up right. Yep, I think I've got everything set up right still. Okay. So over on the right here is my digital software used for operating all the digital modes except for FT8. I have not used FT8 personally, although the Flex does a wonderful job with it. And I don't have to, I'm actually running FLDigi and the Flex on the same computer. And the other nice thing about this is I can actually control the frequency of my Flex from the FLDigi software, or I can control it from the Flex. So if I change the frequency here, if you go over here and look on the Flex, it changes. They're tracking each other. Or if I change the frequency on the Flex side, it changes over here in FLDigi. So FLDigi has the ability to actually control the radio. And the way that's done is by essentially the radio is set up to create the virtual COM ports that you would normally use to connect to an external radio. So if I was trying to connect to a like a Kenwood TS2000, I would have to tell FLDigi that I'm going to use COM port 4 and wire up COM port 4 on my computer into the Kenwood TS2000 radio to run the cat for the cat control cable. Well, instead of having to install a COM port and set that up, I can get to it here. There we go. What you can do on the Flex is they provide a little utility for cat control, and actually does other things. And I simply defined a serial port and assigned it to COM8, and I set COM8 to control VFOA. And then in FLDigi, I set FLDigi up to use COM8 to talk to my radio. And the two automatically talk to each other. No need. I didn't have to install a serial port on my computer. I didn't have to run any cables. So that's really convenient. Same with getting the audio over from the radio into the FLDigi software. They have a utility in Flex called DAX. I'll try to bring that up over here. This is the DAX, and the way I have this set up is I actually set it up to send the receive audio from receiver A, slice A as they call it, to come out on what you call DAX channel 1. And then when I go over into FLDigi to set up my sound card, I actually see a sound card channel named DAX RX channel 1. And I just set it up to configure that. So again, I don't have to run any cables from the microphone jack or anything like that. It's all done in software. So it makes it really simple. One of the things I see here, I think Jerry sent me a message here. So Jerry was going to go real time here. Jerry, I don't know, do you want to send another message? Let's see if it looks like it decoded it just fine if you want to send me another message.
Okay, we can give it a try.
You can see it come through right here on FLDigi.
Okay, let's just see if I can get this to work. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like I got a couple of errors, so I'm not sure if that because your signal. Okay, now I see your signal. It's coming through. Oh, you're a little off here. Let me tune you back in. You were a little off frequency. Here you go. Send it again. I had to tune you in. You came in a little, not much off frequency, but just a little bit. Should be ready to go. There we go. WR4T, DEVE9CD. You're coming through fine.
Okay.
So what are we, Jerry? About 1,100 miles apart? I think something like that. I think we're about 1,100 miles apart. So
I can check that out.
And you can see this is Jerry's signal on the waterfall display right here. This line. And you can see my noise floor right now looks like it's around S8. Let's see how strong your signal is, Jerry.
All right.
S7 is my noise floor. Yeah, about S7, S8.
Here we go.
Here he is right here. Not really moving the S8. You're maybe 1S unit.
Well, I'm running 50 watts, by the way.
Okay. And yeah, coming through with no errors. Those last two transmissions came through with no errors. So it really makes running the digital modes really easy and simple. A lot of people with the more advanced Flex, so the more advanced Flex has 4 receivers. You can have 4 simultaneous receivers on the more advanced one. And then their top end model has 8 simultaneous receivers. So a lot of these guys who are really hardcore enthusiasts, they'll have their software set up to decode and be monitoring multiple bands simultaneously. And they'll have a dedicated receiver. They'll have a dedicated receiver for digital modes, and then they might be rag chewing or doing something else with one of the other slice radios. So it really adds a whole new set of capabilities and dimensions to some of the things you can do. And like I said, all the radios now look like they're going to the software-defined architecture. So, even if you don't think you're interested in this, it's very likely that your next radio you buy, whether it's a Flex or not, is going to have some of these capabilities. You might have to do it differently than you do with the Flex, but it probably has some of this, going to have very similar capabilities. And competition's great. Maybe some of the other guys will come out with new capabilities that Flex hasn't thought of yet. So Jerry, I think that's about all I have, and if people want to see me demonstrate something in particular, fire away. I'll see what I can do.
Great.
I could show the how it auto, the radio. One of the cool things this radio does is it automatically calibrates its frequency display to WWV. It's got a built-in little algorithm to it, and it'll automatically calibrate its clock. I shouldn't say local oscillator because it's really a clock to synchronize with WWV.
Thank you so much, Ted. You've really done a super job presenting FlexRadio and SDR. It was really, really well done. Appreciate it.
Great. Does everyone recognize what this is going on to the right of where Jerry and I were sending PSK?
Probably FT8, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all FT8.
FT8.
Yep, that's all the FT8 signals going on. So, and
well, there might be some questions there, Ted. Let's throw it open for anybody who has a question for you.
Yes, is it Bernard?
Yeah.
Yep, Bernard.
The A to D converters right at the antenna, I guess, need to be extremely fast. And I've seen that the flex goes up to 6 meter band.
Yes.
Are there any radios that go up to the VHF, UHF, or even higher?
Okay. So, couple of things. First off, your first question. The analog to digital converters have to be fast. They also have to have good resolution or bit depth. So you can't use an 8-bit analog to digital converter. You could, but your dynamic range would be horrible. and that is one weakness with SDRs right now is they have a little bit less dynamic range than state-of-the-art super heterodyne receivers. They're pretty darn good, but there are a few contest situations where it's still advantageous to have a Superhet. But the Flex has 128 megasamples per second, 16-bit analog to digital converter. Almost all what they call direct sampling SDRs have at least 128 megasamples per second, or around that range, around 120 to 128. The ICOM 7300, I think, is also 128. The big difference with the 7300 is it has a 14-bit analog to digital converter instead of a 16-bit. And it has potentially less dynamic range, but it's very hard to capture all the dynamic range available in the 16-bit signals. So the difference may not be as great or even noticeable between a 16 and a 14-bit, at least with current technology. Your second question is about the UHF and VHF bands. So several of the radios are coming in with built-in transverters for 2 meters. So not only do you have 6 meters, they have a built-in transverter, and they offer all the same. So there is a super heterodyne stage down, but down to the HF band, or the 10 kilohertz to 55 megahertz band. So several of the ones I showed earlier, like the Elecraft K4 as an option, will include a 2-meter transverter. And then you have the ICOM 9700. People familiar with the 9700? That's essentially an ICOM 7300 with a down converter to add the UH, and obviously the power amplifier up converter on the transmit side, and the power amplifiers and the filters you need. So it gives you all that same capability for satellite operation.
Okay.
And it's probably the 9700 is probably a very good radio for working the satellites.
I have a small dongle here for
Yes.
New Electric that claims it goes up to 1750 megahertz. How do they do it?
Okay, so they have a down converter essentially in there.
Oh, okay.
So essentially they down convert with a single super heterodyne stage. They'll have a local oscillator and a down converter, and then they'll be running. Now, I have one of those RTL dongles because you could get them for like $19.
Yes.
Mine is also a New Electric. It only had an 8-bit analog to digital converter.
Mm-hmm.
So it works really, it works for $19. It works amazingly well. But boy, it gets overloaded really easily because of the dynamic range limitation. And if you look at it, it can only display about 2 or 3 megahertz of spectrum at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's because the analog to digital converter is running at a much lower speed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks.
Another question, Ted, if you don't mind, what was the cost of your FlexRadio? The one that you have is just the box, right?
The one I have it's kind of interesting. It was $1,999, and I was kind of like, oh well, by the time they add tax and shipping, it'll be like, $2,050, $60. Well, interesting. They're in Texas. The radios are made in Austin, Texas. They didn't charge me any sales tax because everyone in Texas is a rebel. And shipping and handling was free. So it was actually I actually got billed $1,999 and no cents. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised. And it included a power cable and a microphone. I didn't here's it comes with a hand mic. One of the things I should show people real quick, because it's kind of important, is the back panel. Just so people, because the only connection I have in between my computer and the radio is a Ethernet connector. And that's the only connection I have. Technically, the Ethernet connector goes to my router, but you can plug it directly into your here we go. You can plug it directly. Here's the back panel. Okay. So you've got 2 antenna jacks. As I said, I can switch between 2 different antennas, but if I have 2 receivers open at the same time, they're going to be either on antenna 1 or antenna 2, both at the same time. I cannot have one on the 80-meter antenna and another one on the 40-meter antenna. The transmitters can do that because they have a relay and they just switch, and you only transmit on one frequency at a time. You actually have these transverter jacks on here, so if you want to run an external transverter, the nice thing about the Flex is it can talk to your external transverter. It can do all the frequency conversions for you, so it actually displays your true on-air operating frequency. It's not like running a transverter with another radio where it just displays the IF frequency. It'll actually show your actual transmit and receive frequency. So I've got the 2 antenna jacks hooked up. I have this Ethernet cable connected on mine. I use 2 different linears. I have a linear I use on 160 and 80, and another linear I use on 40 and 20. So I've got a like a TX keying jack. It has 3 of them. And this one is used to key linear 1. This is used to key linear 2. One thing I can tell you is be extremely careful before you plug your linear into these, because you can burn these up. If you've got an old Heathkit SP220 or a Kenwood TL922 that has a negative 100 plus keying voltage on it, these are only good for 40 volts and I think 150 milliamps. And if it takes more than that to key your linear, you can damage these. So you need to put an opto isolator or some kind of buffer. But you can key up, you can have up to key up 3 different linears or different things like that. So I do use those. This is the jack for an external 10 megahertz reference oscillator. So if you have a GPS synchronized oscillator in your shack and you want to have super precise frequency accuracy, you can hook that up. I have a couple of surplus rubidium oscillators in my shack, so I can run that and be within a couple of millihertz of frequency there. This is the push to talk. This is for your paddles or your key. This is for your microphone, this jack. This is for your headphones. And this is your speaker output. Now, one thing I do have to mention to people, this is a little odd and probably a cost reduction measure on first. This is a line level output. It's not low impedance. It cannot drive a speaker. It's just a line level. It's essentially the same as the speaker output jack on a computer, and you have to connect amplified speakers. And you have to be careful of what kind of amplified speakers you get, because some of them are susceptible to RF. So I've tried a couple of speakers here, and I found a Sony. It was an iPod docking station that my son had from the maybe around 2005 era for an iPod, and it actually is it's a Sony. It's very immune to RF, and it works great as my amplified speaker. But that is something I would say can be a kind of a frustration to a new ham if you hook up just any old PC speakers and get RF in them.
Ted, let's just throw it open for a couple more brief questions and answers, because we have some other things on the agenda we want to get through before 9 o'clock. So anybody else have any quick questions requiring a quick answer?
Yes, Ted. Quite often when I hear these Flex radios on air, I notice that the audio is very sharp, and there's not that much bass response to them. And I was wondering if that's a built-in or whatever.
Well, it's probably someone just not being exactly sure how to set it up. Let me show you real quick usually what happens. So if I go to let's see here, am I in the right mode? Yes, I think. Okay, yeah, I'm in the right mode. I'm in phone. There is a control panel for voice modes where you set your transmit audio bandwidth. Okay. And if you notice, the way I have it set right now is my low cut frequency is 50 hertz and the high cut is 3,500 hertz. I think the default, let me see if I can find out what one of the defaults looks like. Maybe one of those. Okay, that one's 100 hertz. If this low cut frequency gets set high, you're gonna, if someone sets that up at 200 or 300 hertz, it's going to sound very, sharp and a little bit more on the tinny side. The one thing you do, I don't know how many of you guys have noticed this, but there are a lot of people out there now who run their transmit bandwidth all the way up to 8 kilohertz, particularly on 80 meters. They call it enhanced single sideband or extended. I'm not a big fan of it. I think it's kind of pointless, but because quite frankly, I never set my receive bandwidth that wide.
Joe, does that answer your question about quality of the audio?
Yep.
Okay. One more quick question, and we really have to move on. Anybody else? Sorry, Ted, but we have another couple. We have another presentation there that we want to get in before the time's up. So,
okay.
Thank you very, very much, Ted.
And I will stop sharing.
Great job, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome, and thank you again for the invitation.
Okay.